Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, with a presentation that gives you a really useful way of analysing the crises that the Soviet Union faced as it tried to maintain its heavy-handed control over Eastern Europe. If you step back and look at the three crises in your study, Hungary, Berlin, and Czechoslovakia, you can see 6 important common factors. Hope was squashed, and squashed again and again. Political oppression was the means by which the national communist parties and the Soviet Union kept control. Economic failings were highlighted by comparisons with the West. There was a sense of being occupied, and this led to a frustrated nationalism. And there was the role played by young people. The first common factor is that hope was squashed, and squashed again and again. Socialism had seemed an attractive alternative in the wake of World War I, the Great Depression, and then the rise of fascism and World War II. Not for everyone, of course, but in all 3 countries there were those who felt let down by capitalism and saw liberal democracies as merely another way for the old elites to carry on as before. Communism promised a different way, a brighter future. However, Stalinism had been brutally oppressive, and both Khrushchev and Brezhnev had disappointed. Communism hadn't brought a better life. The second factor is that political oppression was the means by which the national communist parties and the Soviet Union kept control. It meant minimal individual or personal freedom, no political freedom, control of the media, strict censorship of the written and the spoken word, a secret police to keep a careful eye on the people, and Cominform to keep a careful eye on their leaders. The third factor is that economic failings were highlighted by comparisons with the West, even though the West had its own problems. The economies of Eastern Europe remained too closely geared to the needs of the Soviet Union, which were dominated by the Cold War and the need to defend communism, meaning excessive spending on the military. As a result, there was a very weak consumer economy across Eastern Europe. And to make matters worse, the army, where all that government spending went, was repeatedly used to keep the people oppressed. The fourth factor is that there was also a sense of being occupied. The picture I show on this slide is the Stalin monument in Budapest that would be toppled in the uprising of 1956. And they were Soviet troops and tanks that quashed that uprising, rumbling along the streets of Budapest. It was the Soviet Union that was behind the building of the Berlin Wall. And they were Soviet troops and tanks, amongst others, that had crushed the Prague Spring. In this sense, the Brezhnev Doctrine and the Berlin Wall can be seen as an admission of failure. Communism had to be enforced. It would not be the chosen path of free people. This led to the fifth factor, frustrated nationalism. It wasn't just a revolt against communist oppression, but against Soviet oppression. it wasn't just a bid for political freedom, but for national independence. The Soviet Union had extended its empire into Eastern Europe. And the sixth and final factor was the role played by young people, those who saw an awful future for themselves. The students who led the street protests in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, the young skilled workers who fled from Berlin, the gaping hole in the Iron Curtain. And the picture I show is of a symbolic funeral for the Soviet Union by Ukrainian youth in Kiev in 1990. All 6 points lead to the conclusion that perhaps containment was working. And I'll leave you with the notes framework I use in my ebook, Problems in the Eastern Bloc and the End of the Cold War, to enable you to provide specific examples of how these 6 common factors showed themselves in each crisis. So there you have my 6 common factors that I feel can help you in A questions that ask you to describe events, in B questions that ask you why there was a crisis, and in C questions that ask you about the similarity between the 3 crises that are used as examples of unrest in your topic. I'll look at differences in another presentation. And I think this will also help your understanding of why Soviet control in Eastern Europe eventually collapsed. However, for this presentation, it remains only for me, as I hope I always do, to thank you for listening. Do subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. It makes me feel wanted. But for now, cheers.